I'd like to start by thanking you for being here. As Sokuzan often does, just let you know that we really appreciate all the support you show through your contributions and your participation. There's a great deal, and I mean a great deal, that goes into keeping this functioning, operating up and running, just being able to continue to make these teachings available, let alone the maintenance of the building. So anything you can offer is always greatly received and appreciated. And again, if nothing else, your greatest gift is your participation in these teachings and practices. The three jewels, I really do enjoy talking about this topic. It's interesting that if you take any teaching in Buddhism, there's not one talk to be given about it. This is not a topic that, well, it's been covered, because the context in which it's given and talked about is so variable. So the three jewels, everybody knows those: the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And those are called the refuge vows. We take refuge. And this is something that I think is important. That this is what oftentimes I think is lost in Buddhism, is if somebody's not practiced Buddhism, they say, well, it's not a religion, it's a way of life. No, well, okay, maybe somewhat. But it's not, despite being asked to give some subjectivity on these three jewels, the spiritual path, we have to investigate the subjectivity very closely. And so we have these forms and we have these containers which help us investigate that subjectivity, which we don't have a lot of say-so over. So the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, although we relate to them subjectively, they're a constant reminder which we're not really in a position to modify. So the first jewel is the Buddha, and the Buddha takes many forms. We could start with the historical form of Shakyamuni Buddha or Gautama, who lived 2,500 years ago. But what's important to recognize is that this individual, in a sense, does not represent something unique, but represents something universal. And so it's easy to look at these great masters, whether it's Shakyamuni or Mahakashyapa, Vasubandhu, Bodhidharma, the Karmapas, any of them, and think of them as mythological or historical figures that we wish we could go back in time to meet, instead of recognizing the immediacy that they represent, that nothing has been lost over time, realization has not become tarnished, but the Buddha represents the living quality of awakening, the immediate quality of awakening. Taking refuge in the Buddha is different in different lineages. In the Theravadan tradition, there's only one Buddha per I believe, Kalpa. There's only one Buddha per, I don't know how long a Kalpa is, 100,000 million years. But the idea is that none of us will ever attain Buddhahood. Shakyamuni attained Buddhahood when the teachings disintegrate so far. This is when the next Buddha, Maitreya, the Buddha of the future, the next Kalpa's Buddha. So this is a Theravadan approach. So the Theravadans strive for arhatship, which would be a recognition of no self. And that should not be undermined. It's tremendous realization and appreciation we can have for that tradition and the awakening as it's represented in the Theravadan tradition. In the Zen tradition, we have Zen masters, these awakened beings. And this is a sense where we would talk about Buddha. So in Mahayana Buddhism, one can awaken to Buddhahood. And one of the prime examples, classical examples, would be the sixth Chinese patriarch, Hui Neng. And his text, the platform scripture, the platform sutra, in Mahayana Buddhism is, as far as I know, the only text that's called a sutra that's not directly attributed to the Buddha. And that's what a sutra is. It's the teachings of the Buddha. Hui Neng has the platform sutra. So his students saw him as the Buddha, and historically he's talked about as a Buddha. So this lineage continues, but the example that we often use would be maybe more from the Tibetan lineage. And in the Tibetan Buddhism, the representation of the guru is the Buddha. And there's something called pure perception. And I, again, trying to give some classical examples, and I will endeavor to talk about some of the subjectivity, but Something in the way that the Tibetans relate to the teacher is very unique, in that every single expression of body, speech, and mind, this is classical of body, expressions of form, expressions of speech and sound and noise, and expressions of mind and thought. Everything the teacher expresses through these three is an expression of awakening or realization. So there's a greater emphasis or a different type of emphasis placed on the teacher or the guru in Tibetan Buddhism. And it's the student's intention through their vows, through their commitment to the teacher to maintain pure perception. And I know we don't use that word maintain, but that's the idea. Maintain pure perception. But it doesn't stop at the teacher. The student is endeavoring to recognize every expression of body, speech, and mind, every physical form we encounter to be the body of the Buddha, every noise we hear to be the sacred mantra, and every thought that arises as the pristine Buddha mind. So we are not awakening to an elevated being, we are awakening to the divinity, the sacredness of everything. So Buddha is talked about in a lot of different ways in that regard. The Dharma similarly can be approached in different ways. The Dharma traditionally would be talked about as the teachings, the law, or the truth. And again, if we start with the Theravadan example, we have the Tripitaka, or the three baskets of the Theravadan tradition, and not just the Theravadan tradition. The Tripitaka is part of all forms of Buddhism. Every form of Buddhism recognizes and relates to the Tripitaka. It would be the sutras, the words of the Buddha. It would be the Abhidharma. The Abhidharma, I like when it's described as Buddhist psychology. It's talking about the systems of consciousness, the five skandhas, the 12 links, the ways in which mind is delineated to look at it in a very scientific or forensic approach. This is the Abhidharma. And then the Vinaya, which would be the classical monastic code, so that when one receives ordination as a bhikshu or a bhikshuni, a male or female monastic, this is the code of discipline and rules that they would guide their life by. Mahayana Buddhism builds on that Theravadan tradition. There are texts that the Theravadins don't necessarily recognize, like the Heart Sutra, Samdhi Nirmochana Sutra, the Tathagata Garbha Sutra, and the collection within the Vajrayana or Tibetan Buddhism is even more expansive to include the Tantras, which were initially very secret teachings that came from India and were transmitted orally for generations before they were written down. And then the last one would be the Sangha, which is a community of practitioners, originally the collection of bhikkhus and bhikshunis that practiced the way of the Buddha, that followed the Vinaya, that followed the Abhidharma and the sutras. And we come to recognize the value of lay practitioners in Mahayana Buddhism through texts like the Vimalakirti Sutra. So a pretty dry introduction to the three jewels. And I think that if I were to go into some of the subjectivity around the three jewels and my relationship over time to these three, that the training one receives in the context of these three is it's priceless or measureless. That to isolate the practice of meditation, which was my endeavor from the beginning, to isolate the practice of meditation to awaken or to see more clearly or to alleviate suffering, that was my intention. And I have this vivid memory of coming to Sokuzan early on. It was a bit I don't know, Sokuzan might be able to describe it better, but crass, rude, arrogant. And I didn't want to take Sokuzan as a teacher. I told him I was not interested in practicing Buddhism, but I wanted to practice meditation. And even with my intention in moving here was very much about isolating this practice of meditation. The reason this is difficult is that when we just take one thing, the way in which the subjectivity, our own subjectivity, allows us to navigate that one thing. So meditation, to just take meditation and relate to it exclusively, rejecting anything else that comes along with it, allows us to use meditation in such a way that it may provide some relief, it may provide some insight, but it also comes with a lot of locking down because it has to reject a great deal. And it was over time that the three jewels came to inform meditation practice for me. And I think some of you can recognize this. And the first one being the recognition of Sokuzan as a teacher, as my teacher. And what that took out of the equation or challenged in the equation was the intellectualizing of meditation, because the teacher has a way of disrupting our meditation practice or encouraging us into areas that we started to move away from, the difficult parts, the parts of meditation where it doesn't feel so good. The Dharma, in a similar way, begins to inform our meditation practice just by beginning to give us a conceptual framework to look at something like emptiness, to begin to conceptually look at the idea of being without reference point, of formlessness. Because the subjectivity of meditation by itself is about what feels good and how do I maintain that. But when the teachings are allowed to come in and you could say fertilize our meditation practice, it starts to acknowledge how vast meditation is. It's not just a simple, small, isolated container. And it's with these two that, for me, I was able to begin to relate to the Sangha as a teacher. And that was because I had not given the Sangha formal permission to teach me, and yet the teachings were occurring anyway. I did not give the Sangha permission to correct me or to have feelings about me or what I was doing, and yet it was happening anyway. And really, to me, it's within the context of all of these that any one of those jewels has so much strength, but not in isolation, but in coming together. The confusing part for me, I think that was something Sokuzan asked me to talk about a little bit. What was so confusing to me is to be in relationship to these three jewels without the idea of outcome. That to maintain presence and connection to the Sangha is not so that the Sangha may someday function in perfect harmony, but that our own edges are softened enough where we have a willingness to function in the context of what can be a chaotic situation. I know that idea of a pressure cooker comes up sometimes, but I also like the image of a rock tumbler. It's like if you've ever put rocks into a rock tumbler, it's like they beat on one another until all of their edges become quite smooth. But the process is quite violent. I'm not saying that this is a violent environment, but our sharp edges are inevitably going to hang out at some point. If you come for a week or you come for a month, you can maintain some semblance of sanity. Eric's looking very sane this last few days. If you stay long enough, at some point, something is going to cause you trouble. And you can't just push through it because there's a light at the end of the tunnel when you're going to get to leave. So it's very confusing to come together with a group of people and not have that traditional mindset of keeping the bad away and maintaining what is close, but to utilize the situation as it arises to look more closely at our own subjectivity. Because this is so difficult and because it's so counterintuitive, I think this is part of why the strength of the teacher is so important, because we may not be able to stay in that situation by ourselves because it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. Why would I continue to relate to somebody that I find so offensive, so abrasive, so difficult? And so sometimes that external reminder of being with all things, being with everything that arises, helps us begin to maybe not understand intellectually, but recognize the value of continuing to put ourselves in situations that challenge our fixed ideas or fixed beliefs. Just one more classical aspect of the three jewels I thought I would touch on. There was probably 6 or 8 months that Sokuzan had me studying a text, which I'm forgetting the name of. the Ratnagotra Vibhaga or the Uttara Tantra Shastra. And it talks about the 7 Vajra points, and the first 3 being the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And it's a text that's said to be from Maitreya, that Ashtanga's yoga. Who is Vasubandhu's brother? Asanga. That Asanga is said to have received from Maitreya. And Maitreya says, of the 3 jewels, it is the Buddha that is most important. And I think that's fascinating, but the idea being that had Shakyamuni Buddha not sat under the Bodhi tree, he would not have been able to share the Dharma. And in sharing the Dharma, those of us that are interested could not have gathered together to try to understand that Dharma. And we continue to recognize that value through a lineage, through the successive transmission of these teachings, so that the Dharma can continue to be expounded, classically talked about as turning the wheel of the Dharma. Something that you may ask the teacher, please, teach, or will you please turn the wheel of the Dharma, so that we can continue to gather around as a community to endeavor to understand that. So as I said, there's a lot of ways to go into these 3 jewels, and they're very personal, they're very intimate, and they change over time. But I would open up to see if there's any questions, Shoto.
Is the way that we receive the Dharma from the Buddha different than how we would receive it from the Sangha?
Well, initially it would be. And a lot of that has to do with our prejudice, that with and working with a teacher, there's maybe not a lot, but a little bit of letting the guard down, a little bit of openness to receive something we might not be willing to receive from somebody else. But ultimately, nothing's expressing anything different. So it's not like 2 things are expressing 2 different things. But we have to start somewhere. And I've said that many times before. I think that sometimes the teacher functions as a starting point for the rest of the world, for our willingness to relate to the rest of the world. You have to have some level of confidence or enthusiasm or inspiration to relate to something before you can relate to everything. So as far as I can tell initially on the path, yes, there is a difference, but that has more to do with our prejudice than what we're actually relating to.
Sure, bowing. It seems like the teacher might give us some direction, like where we actually are doing something based off of an instruction. Do we begin to do that with the Sangha? Like if the Sangha suggests we do something in a certain way, do we try to do those things?
Well, I think this is a really interesting question, and it would come down to how you understand doing what the teacher asks you to, because you might actually find yourself initially acting out of stupidity with the teacher. There's some sort of idealism that you're trying to live up to, so you might actually begin to infuse a level of intelligence, and that's not logic or rebuttals, but it's questions. It's clarifying what the teacher's actually asking or talking about instead of just obeisance. Similarly, when you relate to the Sangha, you might start to find yourself having a little more intelligence instead of the knee-jerk reaction to disagree or reject. So it's relating to the situation out of curiosity and not out of a standard.
So that request was to talk about the 3 jewels and tell us subjectively how you've been helped by them. So, and I know we have to speak relatively, but of the 3 jewels, which has helped you the most and which has helped you the least?
I think it's a valid question, and it's one I don't think I can discriminate. I think that all of them have supported my relationship. So my relationship to Sokuzan has supported my relationship to Dharma and Sangha, and Dharma has supported my relationship to Sokuzan and Sangha has supported my relationship to Dharma and Sokuzan. As I said, the entry point for me was Sokuzan, but in relating to the Sangha, it's helped me relate to Sokuzan You can't understand the teachings of the Sangha without understanding the relationship to the teacher. And similarly, when you hear something like the Sangha is the representation of the Sangha as the teacher in many parts, it actually allows you to understand the relationship to the teacher more closely. So for me to say that which one's the least helpful, that doesn't even register. I don't really understand what that would mean. But I see how at different times I may need to relate to one more closely than the other. Something that has happened early on is Sokuzan has really put me in the midst of working with Sangha. That has been really from almost day one, trying to understand what he's asking me to do when he says, I want you to be the Ino to these residents that are 10, 15, 20 years older than you. And they're not going to do what you say, but I want you to do it anyway. So I think that working with Sangha has been one of the greatest teachings Sokuzan has introduced me to, as well as my continued, particularly my private relationship to Sokuzan has been something I don't know that I could characterize. Wozuku.
Bowing, you use the analogy of the rock tumbler.
Mm-hmm.
Is it your experience that your edges are smoother now?
I could say if we're talking about subjectivity, I feel that yes. There is a type of softness that was not accessible early on, but the people that would be better able to tell you that would be Sokuzan or Shoka, who we've been relating for 14 years now to one another. Unyo, similar, I've known her since I was in college, going up to prisons with Sokuzan and Unyo. And it's interesting to have come to this situation at the age I was in and now slowly beginning to recognize what it means to be in your early 20s, and just probably pretty interesting for someone like Unyo who's
In my early 20s.
like 15 years older than me, only maybe 40 years older than me, or so, 41 years older than me. So to watch some of that transition, is that realization? No, but I think Sokuzan's called it byproducts. So yes, I would say that some of those edges have softened and some of them have become more refined. So they might actually be sharper in some situations.
Bowing, continuing with that image, do softer edges feel like vulnerability in some ways? Or what does it even mean to have softer edges? I'm trying to flesh out that.
I don't know what it would mean for each one of us. I just feel like in a very strange situation with the subjectivity instruction, because usually that's something I'm trying to minimize, but I feel just an overwhelming affection for the people that live here. Like it really overwhelms me sometimes. Since Sokuzan has had me start facing out during meditation, it just looking around the room, there's something very sensitive or emotional about that. And that is not really, there's not anyone that's particularly excluded from that. And that doesn't mean I don't have bad thoughts or negative feelings about people at times. So it's, yeah, I think there's a softness to it.
Bowing, how would, try to be stuck on this image, but I literally can't think of something else, but how would getting tumbled around by what feels like a lot of rough edges, how would that, in what way in this context does that soften you instead of in another context, it could very easily just harden you?
I think it has to be coupled with the intention to see our positionality, see our preferences, so that when those situations arise, when conflict arises, there's still the impulse or the reaction of aggression or defensiveness. That's my big one, defensiveness. But when we come back to the intention to reflect on what can this help me see about my own preference, my own prejudice, my own aggression. So you're right, if it doesn't have some inspiration around service or curiosity or the vows, it could very much just harden you. You could become more and more isolated. But that's why we have to have that coming together of all the three refuges, the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, the Bodhisattva vows. Sokurin.
Sokurin bowing. The Buddha left his wife and child, and in this community, we're encouraged to include our families. How has these refuge vows evolved into what they are today? How does that look to you now? It looks different than how it began.
I think there's an understanding that the fertile ground of training is not limited to one environment. I do come back to that idea of a starting point, though, that the idea that training in regards to the family life is only enhanced by being connected into a strong training situation, like having a teacher, having formal vows, perhaps. Whereas initially there probably was more of a need to go along the lines of traditional religious paths at the time, or to create something that had a much stronger form so that it could be established. And I think I've seen that over the years in being here, that the way I was instructed in forms was a lot different than the way forms are instructed now, because something had to be established. There had to be a little bit more insistence or maybe a more rigid approach to forms that now is able to be a little bit softer.
Sokurin bowing, where does family fit into the three jewels? Bowing.
It's a really good question. And I think that initially I would lean towards Sangha. I could also see where it would arise as Dharma and would arise as Buddha, but initially Sangha, companions, people not to correct or modify, but to be in the midst of or to work with. And as you know, having children, we're encouraged not to teach our children how to function as far as religion or practices go. So it is a strong mirror. It really, for me, is a strong reflection of my impulse to help mold Rumi into a good person or a model citizen. Shoka?
Shoka, I may have missed it, but I feel like you spoke to the subjectivity of the Buddha and the Sangha. Can you speak to how the refuge of the Dharma has helped you in a personal way? And I'm thinking in particularly in relation to talking about this intellectualization of one's practice.
Well, as you know, I've been really inspired by these early Tang Dynasty Zen masters. There's something that I just find quite moving. Their pointedness and conciseness, and the way that it's able to point at something without explaining it. So it's able to point without giving you a map. Like, here's how you see this. Here's the 10 things you need to know. It just gives you the pointing. And I know for me, sometimes I go back to the Dharma for inspiration when I feel like I'm having a difficult time continuing to practice. So the Sin Ming is one that I like to return to by Sosan, as well as Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara. There are times that just something about the way that language presents itself, that it just gives me a little burst of energy or motivation to keep going.
Shoka, I think the other aspect of that was, how have they been confusing for you? So how has the Dharma been confusing?
Dogen would be a good example of that for me, that I've never been able to have a really good sense of how to relate to Dogen. I really like it when he talks about Tang Dynasty Zen masters, which is a lot of what he does. but the way in which he communicates is such a direct pointing that I'm left feeling like I have no idea what he's talking about. So the confusion is not really understanding Dogen. The support is the Sokuzan's encouragement to study it, but not worry about understanding it. Or it doesn't say don't worry about understanding. He says it's important to study, but not to understand. So to just continue to return. And recently, as perhaps you know, Sokuzan asked me to stop answering questions for Friday's book studies, which were his talks. And he's asked me to start responding to questions on Dogen. And that's been really helpful because I feel very comfortable in Sokuzan's material. I don't know that there's been more than 5 or 10 talks in the last 12 years that I've missed. So we're talking about literally thousands of hours of listening to Sokuzan's talks. And then he says, now I want you to answer questions about Dogen. And I have been since the beginning saying, I don't know how to work with this. I don't understand it. And now I get to sit in front of a group of people and show everybody how I don't understand it. And it's been really helpful. Naveed?
Naveed bowing. Has Shikantaza been taught in different lineages the way it is taught by Sokuzan? Bowing.
Well, one more time, could you repeat that?
The Shikantaza, has it been taught in different lineages the way it is taught by Sokuzan? Bowing.
Yes. I think Sokuzan provides a very clear and classical instruction on how to practice Shikantaza. Some of the differences, there are contrasts. The one that's probably the most obvious is our encouragement to relate to our bodies in a way that is personal. So moving or adjusting postures, that maybe isn't the most classical approach, but even outside of Zen meditation, I've been reading a meditation instruction by a Tibetan named Kempo Gangshar. And yeah, it's incredible. I think he's actually teaching Dzogchen, more classical Dzogchen, but the way he talks about how to work with or receive or observe the mind very much to me resonates with Sokuzan. And I do feel that Sokuzan's ability to communicate around meditation practice is unique in regards to other teachers I've met in my life. Because if you listen to him long enough, he's not actually saying a thing. He's not actually saying Zazen. He's saying nope, nope, nope. And then you're just left without reference point. Whereas most teachers I meet at some point start to insist on something, a state or a characteristic or something that's maintained, some reference point, and it's sometimes very, very subtle. But I don't find that with Sokuzan. Again, if you look at all the instructions over the years, it's not to say you couldn't pull one out and say, well, right here. But then if you keep reading or you keep listening, the next time it's not there. So to simplify, yes, I find that this style of meditation is being taught in other lineages. But I also think that there is a intelligence that allows us to relate to it very individually. Did you get a haircut, Naveed? It looks nice. Ondo.
Ondavine, have you had, and can you share a time when things were really difficult and how the 3 jewels helped you?
Right now, right now they're very difficult for me. And the 3 jewels help me in different ways. To be very direct, I feel like Sokuzan's been pretty relentless with me over the last year or so. And despite my resistance, has not softened that because I would prefer that. So there's a support in there that I may not be able to recognize conceptually all the time. And that's also been complemented with a tremendous feeling, as I said, of warmth and intimacy with the Sangha. So I don't even have to tell anyone what I'm going through to be able to sit down with any of you and feel like, yeah, I can do this with everybody else because I'm not unique. It's not like no one else is getting a hard time. So that, yeah, that's gone through waves and cycles over the years. And at other times it's the Sangha that I'm just like, why would I continue to relate to these people? And then I come to the teacher and he just gives me everything I need to keep doing that. It's kind of funny, but it's not unfamiliar to any of you to find an enemy in the Sangha and you have to keep coming to the teacher and acting like a baby and like, I'm not getting what I want. And it's devastating because the teacher doesn't give you what you want, but helps you say, yeah, it sucks. Be with all things. Yeah, it sucks. Can you imagine the suffering they're going through? The other way I've felt supported is being supported to go into retreat. That form has been so precious to my practice over the years. Heading into maybe my 10th or 12th solitary retreat, spent, I don't know, 100, 150 days in solitary meditation, and that Sokuzan continues to allow me to return to that form and encourage and support that form, shows how important meditation practice is, that I can step out of everything I'm doing and he's, yes, get into retreat, go into retreat, do that. So I find that form quite supportive.
Shoto bowing. Have you found any support, or could you say anything about looking at the Sangha in the sense of like the celestial Sangha or the Bodhisattvas bowing?
What's interesting is that's also showing up more lately, and it's something I've had a great aversion to over the years. But if you talk about bodhisattvas, like very much so, I feel a strong connection. Sokuzan had me start White Tara practice 10, 11, 12 years ago. And I've done that more times than I can count. So I feel a strong resonance with that. Just the bodhisattvas of the lineage, I feel a deep emotional connection to the lineage. And I'm working more with that idea of asking for help from anything that might be listening. And again, not with the idea that something is listening, but it's that softening of attitude where it doesn't have to be so consolidated into a logic of I'm asking this thing and hoping that this thing will give this in return, but just that idea of offering in the form of asking or supplicating has started to soften over the last 6 months or so. So, yes. Any final questions this evening before we Shan Yu?
Shani bowing. What does returning look like when there's fear in returning? Bowing.
I think it depends on the situation. It's a pretty vague question, and that's nothing wrong with that, but I'll give you an example of the way I've been able to return with fear is to acknowledge the fear. So to return to Sokuzan and acknowledge what I'm afraid of, or to return to the Sangha and recognize that the fear doesn't necessarily have to dissipate. Is there something more around that area that you're asking about?
Probably, but I'm afraid.
I noticed,
it was helpful though. Thank you. What were you gonna say?
No, I was just going to say, as opposed to Navid, I noticed you haven't gotten a haircut.
Yeah, it's getting gnarly.
No, it looks good too. Final question tonight.
You just mentioned that when you have difficulties, you go back to some teachings, especially some teachings you find very inspiring in Tang Dynasty. I'm wondering, how does that inspiration show up for you? Is that a certain tenderness, or it just gives you the masculine support to go? I'm just wondering, how does that show up for you? bowing.
It's much more, it is very relative, it's very subjective, but it's not very conceptual. It's more of like an emotional, like it's re-energizing, where I may feel a tremendous amount of lethargy or apathy, and then something just, I really want to get back to the cushion. I really want to get back and look at this some more. Sometimes watching documentaries about great teachers also have provided that inspiration. Or, everyone has a junk drawer at home. And I don't mean to use the word junk, but I've got a Dharma drawer at home of just different things I've collected, like scraps of paper that maybe Sokuzan's written a note on for me, or there's like little poems that he's written that I make sure I jot them down, and sometimes I go back to those and remember some of that, and it's helpful. The path is difficult, so finding inspiration where we can, how we can, seems supportive.
Thank you, Yuhong Baoying. And I also have a question. You mentioned that I will ask teacher Sokuzan too for my own practice. You mentioned that, excuse me, you mentioned that you practiced the White Tara for a few years. I'm wondering. Sorry. I'm wondering, how does that support your Shikantaza practice?
I'm not sure if I can make that direct link to me sitting in formless meditation in the way I feel like the formless meditation is very self-supportive, and that there are times where having a little bit more of an active practice, which White Tara is, I used it a lot during my mother's passing. I did, tens of thousands or 100,000 of those mantras. And yeah, it's something that's helpful when I need a little bit more activity. And that's something I've worked with in tandem with Sokuzan over the years. Thank you. We can stand and dedicate the merit. I'd like to start by thanking you for being here. As Sokuzan often does, just let you know that we really appreciate all the support you show through your contributions and your participation. There's a great deal, and I mean a great deal, that goes into keeping this functioning, operating, up and running, just being able to continue to make these teachings available, let alone the maintenance of the building. So anything you can offer is always greatly received and appreciated. And again, if nothing else, your greatest gift is your participation in these teachings and practices.